hear what I'm saying, if you can't hear what I'm saying, please let me know, because I gave a presentation a couple of weeks ago and it was only halfway through that someone said, we can't hear you. And that's always very disappointing. So let me know if you can't hear me. So what is physiotherapy? Well, I think what we're trying to get to here is that physiotherapy is not just confined to clinical practice. Physiotherapy's scope of practice is really much broader than that. It encompasses patient, client care, health management, research, policy making, which might involve educating and consulting, especially when there's an issue of public health and safety. So that's really what I'm thinking about when I speak about physiotherapy. So my research platform really looks at the aura, the health of people with disabilities, lifelong conditions, and I've got a few interests in and around that. Firstly, I think about inequities for people who have long-term health conditions and disability. I have a particular interest in space, place, time, which includes this sort of idea around green space and parks. For the purpose of today, and I know everybody has quite different perspectives on this, but I will be using the term disabled people. It is often the preferred term by disabled people themselves in terms of the Disabled Persons Assembly, but I know that this is also a matter of identity. So I don't mean to give offence, but that will be the term that I use. And it comes from this kind of concept of social disability. So the way I think about health outcomes really does come from thinking about the other factors that influence our health and well-being. And I very strongly feel that many of our health outcomes are created by factors outside of the health system that can easily affect our well-being, the society we live in, and of course the environment that we all live in.
Meredith, sorry, there has just been a message in the chat saying somebody has lost your sound. Maybe just do a wee show of hands in the gallery. If you can hear Meredith, okay, put your hand up perhaps, or use your emoticon thingy.
Okay, I think
most people got it.
Okay, all right.
It's a singular issue.
A single issue, sure.
Yeah.
All right, well, just let me know. Okay, so today we are thinking about this idea around green space and parks, and this was an area of interest for me that started about 5 years ago, where I started to think about park and green space use for people with disability. I will be speaking about paediatric relevant findings, but there is still some crossover between older adults who have disability as well. So I'm guessing you all know this, but and this data is old, I have to admit. It comes from the Disability Survey, which was last run in 2013. But it perhaps gives us a better reflection of the prevalence of disability than the use of the Washington group set questions. But we can have an argument about that later. But what we do know is that 15% of children in New Zealand from that data reported having an impairment or disability. And we know that this has an impact on quality of life, family and social connectivity, and the direct and indirect costs of each for this is, 100 million per annum in New Zealand. So we're thinking about a lot of resources and not necessarily a good quality of life always. So with this kind of thinking and background, I was thinking about, well, what do we know in public health world that can improve health and well-being? And one of those things is physical activity. We do know that people who are more physically active have higher levels of health-related fitness, lower risk profiles for developing other medical conditions, and a decreased rate of developing comorbidities. So we know that physical activity is important. And then how this fits with green space. Well, when we're thinking about green space and parks. There was this really wonderful article that, it did come out a few years ago now, but it was across 14 cities in the world, including New Zealand, and they found that park sector has a huge role in improving physical inactivity in our populations. So we know that green space will really help physical activity. So that means that green space and parks are an environmental factor that could really be of benefit to people of all abilities. So I just mentioned this. We know that people who access parks often meet the recommended physical activity levels. We also know that parks can just provide a place to be, and this can have wonderful influence on stress and anxiety levels. It can improve social connectivity, and some of that comes not from doing things in the park, but from sitting there or from the getting there. So what we know is that park use is associated with physical, psychological, and social well-being and improvements in those areas. And of course, parks and green space provide a place to play, particularly when we think about it from an intergenerational concept. So older adults can use parks and playgrounds. Children and older adults can play. People with different abilities should be able to play. And I think it's really important that these environments actually do spread out across the generations. But of course, this can only happen if green space and park environments are accessible. And what I'm getting at here is that if park spaces and green spaces are created predominantly for the majority, then that small but perhaps arguably more important group of people are marginalised or excluded. So when everything is kind of created the same and there isn't co-design, we actually do still get inequities in ability to access the park. So one of the things that we first did was we looked at what was out there in the evidence. That's one of the things you do as a researcher. You look to the literature, and we did an integrative review. These were the key aims. We wanted to know what was there in terms of interventions or park-based interventions for disabled people, and we wanted to see what kind of evidence there was for older adults compared to children. We had quite a systematic search. We looked for studies that really included the use of parks, and specifically parks that were free and accessible. So we're not talking about parks in perhaps a museum that you had to pay to get into. We're talking about council or government managed parks that were free. We included literature that had people who had a disability, and we were taking that from the World Health Organization definition. So that interaction between a health condition, the person, and environment. We included qualitative, quantitative, mixed methods, all sorts. And then we kind of did this integrative review to look at what really were the benefits that we could find in the literature. And this is the paper if you want to have a look at it. We were actually only able to find 10 studies when we did this review. All of them were from high-income countries, and they had quite a wide age range from 7 to 86 years, with a variety of health conditions. So the participants in each of these 10 studies had a variety of health conditions. So cerebral palsy, learning disabilities, mobility impairments. When we looked at the outcomes, when we were thinking about physical, psychological, spiritual, and social, we did find really similar findings to the general population, as you would hope, that parks are really great at improving health, really, really great at actually enabling people to meet activity guidelines. We found that older adults tend to use parks intentionally. So older adults with disability tended to use the parks intentionally for that express purpose of improving physical activity and physical well-being. Whereas for children, it was often incidental. They went there for play, but they got physical improvements in their well-being anyway. There was lots of data in these studies that we included that talked about parks being beautiful. It gave older adults this sort of sensation of renewal, restoration, rejuvenation. And for children, it really helped develop creativity, imagination, and increase their confidence and sense of accomplishment. From that sort of social perspective, people really talked about the fact that families and friends did come together, and that's what we'd kind of already picked up from, just general reading in the literature. Parents noticed that children had improved social integration, especially when they started to play with their peers who didn't have a disability. So it really helped that kind of social well-being as well. But what we did find is that not all parks were accessible. And when they weren't accessible, people felt unwelcome, and they felt that they were not part of society. And that came quite through quite strongly in the literature. So to sum that all up, we can see that parks and green space do have beneficial outcomes for young and older disabled people. It also provided disability-specific health outcomes, so not just general health outcomes were improved, but disability-specific health outcomes were improved. So, for example, children with autism, there was improved ability to concentrate. That's just one example. But there was hardly any literature on the role of parks or green space for young adults or adults. So there was really only literature for children and older adults with disability. So the next thing we wanted to look at is whether older adults do access parks in New Zealand. And I'm not going to spend too much time here because I know this is really about paediatrics. But this was a survey that we conducted a few years ago now. And we did a random survey of 1,000 adults taken from the electoral roll, and we had 400 respondents. And we were looking for comparisons between those with impairment and those without. And I think there's a couple of really interesting things to point out here. You can see that older adults without impairment, they actually go to parks, green space fairly frequently. Those with impairment, not so frequently. But this bit is really quite frightening. Those without impairment, there was only 26% of them, older adults, who never went to a park, but 43% with impairment never go to a park. So that's a really quite a big difference. So if you want to read about that study, it's in this paper here. But one of the key kind of findings that we got from this is that older adults go to be with friends and family, just like we found in the literature, but this is New Zealand specific data now. Older adults with impairments go, but they find it much harder to get there. And so I think what we have to think about there is that older adults with disability did not feel that parks were designed with them in mind. And really quite interestingly, older adults who were from different ethnic groups felt marginalised, twice over. That cultural content of a park was just as important as the accessibility. So here are some quotes from that. This particular person is talking about, when the park was really close, it made it much easier for her to get there. So she says, thank goodness it's I don't have to go very far. This particular person was talking about park layout and the number of accessible toilets in the park. And it's a little bit tongue in cheek, but is saying, you get so far through the park and then you almost have to ring a taxi to get you back to where the toilet is. And then this one is, from one of the people who identified as being from Pacific culture. And they were really saying that for them, even if it was accessible from their disability perspective, this person was a double amputee, they wouldn't go because they didn't feel welcome from a cultural perspective. They really felt like the park needed to have something there that spoke to them. So I think that even though that's older adults, it's still very applicable to children. So this particular study now is really thinking about the children that we interviewed and their families. And the idea was to ask them about their experiences of using their local neighbourhood park. We used lots of different strategies to recruit people, and went back to the participants to check that our data made sense to them. So this is an example of who was in this research, and there was quite a broad mix of different impairments. So people had cerebral palsy, epilepsy, lower limb amputation, vision impairments, neuropsychological impairments. So only one child could use or would use their local park. So we had to actually change the kind of aim of our study in the end, okay? They chose to go to other parks. And then there were three key themes that we got from this. First of all, that parks were valued by these children and their families. They really felt that the multisensory environments that were there benefited their physical, psychological, social well-being. And it was a really great place for challenging their capability and their independence. And we can see here, these are just some of the quotes. They like to walk in the bush. There's improvement in motor and gross motor skills and strength, definitely social improvements. And the children themselves said, I feel really strong when I'm in the park. I like going here with my friends. Yeah, we kind of like to hang out. Whereas other children said, I don't actually like playing in the park. I can't play with most of the stuff. And if I do play, an adult has to help me, and that's not independent. So going to the park for the children was really a kind of a thinking around protected choice from the adults. Their caregivers chose the park very carefully. They were really mindful of negative interactions that might occur at the park. And so, there's sort of two really key points about this. The distance of getting to the park didn't matter for these caregivers. They would prefer to choose to go further if they were going to have a better experience. The most important part was the people and the place, the environment when they got there. So this just emphasizes this. I would go somewhere where it's well maintained. We don't go to the closest park. We go to the one that we can use. So people were traveling, considerable distances to go to parks that met their needs. When we start to think about the people, so we're thinking about people and place that matter. What they're talking about here is that, when we go to a playground that lots of people come to, it's quite diverse, then there's lots of things happening, and that's really good. As I mentioned before, the park can sometimes have that negative interaction too. And this adult, the park that she initially was trying to go to, she didn't feel very comfortable there. She felt like people were looking at her child, and she felt really, that just increased her anger and frustration. So she no longer went to that park. And when we think about the place, we're thinking about those amenities. From an adult's perspective, people are really thinking about safety. And this particular adult was talking about one of the children in her care who liked to run off, and so was really concerned about a park that had some kind of safety or enclosure in and around it. Whereas this other adult was talking about the fact that he really needed to know that there were toilets at the park. And if you're thinking about families, well, this particular adult was talking about, she had 3 children. The 2 older ones could go off and play, but the youngest one found it more difficult because of what was in the park. So they had to travel to find a park where there was enough equipment, enough of an environment for all 3 of them. finally, this particular adult was feeling quite frustrated on this day, and she was talking about the fact that if children can't be part of it and they can't socialize with their friends, and they can't play together, then the outcomes, they just feel left out and frustrated. So what's the point in going to a park at all? This is a particular image, and you can see this particular child has been left out. This was her son, and she's agreed for us to have this photo. So this is a slightly older study now, but what we did do is we thought, well, let's have a look at the accessibility and usability of parks and playgrounds in the Greater Wellington region. And this has been published as well, and so you can go and have a more in-depth read. But essentially what we wanted to do was have a look at the parks, and also consider if there was any difference by deprivation area. What we found, though, was that there wasn't really any tool that helped us to look at how accessible and usable parks were. So we had to create one, which we did. And that's what I'm talking about in this slide here. We created this parks tool, and then Porirua City Council helped us to kind of develop it and make sure that it made sense. And then we used this tool throughout Porirua, Lower Hutt and Wellington with the permission of those city councils. And in Porirua, just as a side note, they then decided to go on and evaluate every single park that they had with this tool, so that they could incorporate into their 10-year plan upgrades that needed to occur. So the parks tool that we created, it has two sections. The first section kind of looks at the accessible routes, and the second section looks at facilities and amenities. So, the sorts of things we're thinking about in accessible routes is the getting there, the parking, the spacing, the path surfaces. And then the second aspect, we're thinking about play areas, rest areas, multi-sensory play environments, restrooms, drinking fountains. And we used the New Zealand standards as well as overseas tools to kind of help us create this. So what did we find? We found that no park, of the 21 parks that we included, no park met all the national or international guidelines or standards for aspects of park and playground design. And to be fair, some of those parks were very old. They hadn't been upgraded for 15 to 16 years. And most definitely the newer parks met more of the criteria. I think one of the really interesting things about it is that we did find a difference between high and low deprivation areas, with lower deprivation areas meeting less of the accessibility guidelines.
Just have a few more minutes, Meredith, just letting you know.
Oh, great, fine. Okay, so what does this mean? Well, what it says is that there really is some considerations to be thinking about in terms of parks and playgrounds. And we do need to be thinking that the design of these can absolutely influence participation, both from a public health perspective, but also from a disability and managing one's health. I'm going to skip quite a few slides because I want to share this last one. This one here, this particular study we just did recently, and we were looking at physiotherapists' use of green space for people with lifelong / with disability. And we interviewed physiotherapists because we wanted to know whether they purposely included parks or green space in terms of that management consideration. And this is kind of what we found, that there was variable knowledge of what green space is and what its health benefits are by these physiotherapists. They hadn't thought about it from perhaps a Māori health model where we think about whenua and the value of land to wellbeing, and that people's own values, so their beliefs around green space, really really informed what they did from a green space and park perspective. So these physiotherapists, they said, well, it's quite interesting. I've never thought about it. I suppose I could try it. They talked about the fact that they started to think about their own treatment spaces. they said that they themselves sometimes had a passion for it, but they'd never thought that maybe that might be of value to the people that they worked with. They also had some concerns around risks, such as falls, pathogens, particularly because we were doing this study, quite recently, and the inability of them, the clinician, to control that kind of environment that they might be sending, from their terminology, their patients out into. So where am I going with this? I think it's really important that we think about parks and green space from a health perspective and from a public health perspective. And I think we need to kind of disrupt our health service delivery and think about, well, where do we deliver healthcare, and keep challenging that in our own heads. And I'd really, I keep putting in grants, but I'd really like to, have a really co-designed park, not consulted upon park, but co-designed, where the community is brought together and puts it together from the ground up. I think we'd get a really excellent outcome from that, and it could be world standard. So obviously I need to thank lots of people. None of this research happened without funding. And of course, all the collaborators, the people who talked to me, talked to my colleagues, people who gave their data freely, and this little boy, he's vision impaired, and he's on the skate ramp with his bike. So there we go. So that's me. Thank you. I think I kind of got it done in that time.
Thank you so much, Meredith. That's absolutely awesome. We just had one question, if it's possible. I think you're still sharing screen there. So.
Well, I will just stop. There we go.
That's awesome. So one of the questions was, where can we access your evaluation tool? Because it looks amazing. It'd be great if people could do their own auditing of their local area as well.
Yeah. So the PARCs tool, because it's set to standards, and when I say standards, I mean, like when you think about your building code, those have got standards. So some of the terminology is actually a little bit tricky. And I think it really, that kind of auditing probably does need to be done by the councils, and Dunedin City Council has, I ran a training session for them around this. That said, there's no reason why families couldn't look at some of these kind of content areas and think, well, is there these things here? Could there be these things here? But whether they would wish to take it to that next level of technically measuring whether the park meets that height regulation, or the number of accessible versus non-accessible pieces of equipment, I mean, I think that's possibly a bit too much for families who just want to go to a park.
I'm thinking more of the clinicians that are on this meeting today that might want to have a look at that.
Yeah.
Think about those ideas, especially if we're looking at providing therapy outside and in the parks.
Well, I can absolutely share that tool with you. It's been published and people can. Someone said it's really good for schools too. Now, the thing about schools, you probably know this because I have been talking to some schools, is that park playground design and park space design there is kind of up to each school, and the Ministry of Education, as I understand it, and that may have changed in the last year, they don't really pay for the equipment. So it's up to each school and the advocacy of the parents and the understanding of the parents to perhaps challenge the kind of normal equipment. When I say normal, the flying fox these days, usually the bark chips and the tornadoes. That's the kind of things I tend to see in a park.
That's right. Okay, thank you very much. And we've got a few questions coming through and some really lovely feedback, Meredith, about how interesting it's been to have you presenting and catching us up on this. It's fantastic. And I just encourage everybody to join our session on the 9th of November to look at knowledge translation, how we can actually implement and put some of this into practice. And once again, Meredith, thank you so much. I'm sure everyone has really thoroughly enjoyed your presentation.
Great.
Bea, is there anything else you wanted to add? No, we're all good. Lovely. So thank you so much, everybody, and we will see you next time.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.